that faithful evening, neither of them expected what happened in a flash. She was lying in the middle of a Seoul street at 1 a.m., ribs broken, sketchbook pages bleeding ink into the rain, and the man standing over her, hands shaking, eyes wrecked with something that looked nothing like a stranger's guilt, was about to turn her entire life upside down. Not because he was sorry, because he couldn't leave. Pearl Okoye had spent 6 years fighting to be seen in a city that had never made space for her. 3 weeks before the biggest moment of her career, a man too deep in his own grief to watch the road took that fight and shattered it, along with 2 of her ribs and the collarbone she used to sketch with. What she didn't know yet was his name. What she didn't know was the kind of power that name carried in Seoul, the empire behind it, the danger threaded through it, the war quietly brewing inside it. And what neither of them knew, standing there in the rain, strangers held together by collision and consequence, was that this was not the end of anything. This was the beginning of everything. Welcome to Afro-Korean Love Stories. On today's episode, I'm bringing you romance, power, love, mystery, and accidental encounters. If you're just joining us for the first time, hit that like button, subscribe, seat back, and allow me draw you into my world of tales. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd really love to know. Now let's get back to this amazing story. Pearl Okoye was not a woman who made small dreams. She had grown up in Lagos watching her mother hem other women's wedding gowns by candlelight, fingers moving fast and sure even when the electricity was gone, even when the money was thin, even when the neighborhood offered nothing but heat and noise and the particular exhaustion of surviving. Her mother never complained. She just kept sewing. And somewhere in that quiet, relentless devotion, Pearl fell in love, not just with fabric and form, but with the idea that beauty could be made from almost nothing. By 22, she was in Seoul on a design scholarship that she had applied for 3 times before they finally said yes. By 26, she had carved out a small but respected name in the city's independent fashion circles. And now, at 28, she was 72 hours away from confirming her slot at Seoul Fashion Week, a debut showcase that would either launch her into the stratosphere or confirm every doubt she had ever swallowed in silence. She was magnetic in the way that only women who have built themselves from scratch tend to be. Dark skin that caught light like polished mahogany. Eyes that held entire arguments without her saying a word. A mouth that curved into a smile, so warm it made people feel chosen. Seoul had not always been easy for her. She knew what it felt like to walk into a room and be underestimated before she opened her mouth, but she had never once let that shrink her. If anything, it sharpened her, made her work harder, stand taller, refuse to disappear. That night, she had left her studio past midnight because she needed air. The collection centerpiece gown was not speaking to her the way it needed to, and Pearl had learned long ago that the worst thing a designer could do was force a garment. Sometimes you had to step away, let the night settle around you, and trust that the idea would find you when it was ready. She was crossing at the pedestrian junction 2 blocks from her studio, sketchbook tucked under her arm, mind floating somewhere between silk draping and the fear that she might actually fail when the headlights found her. She didn't even have time to be afraid. John Hyun-woo had buried his father on a Tuesday. By Thursday, he had sat through 4 board meetings, 2 legal briefings, and 1 extraordinarily cold dinner with his mother where she told him, with the practiced composure of a woman who had married into power, that grief was a luxury the John family could not currently afford. The empire needed its heir. The empire needed him to be ready. He was not ready. His father had been many things, demanding, exacting, occasionally ruthless, but he had also been the only person in Hyun-woo's life who looked at him and saw more than a succession plan. And now he was gone. Suddenly, a heart attack at 61, and the world was moving so fast that Hyun-woo hadn't even found a moment to properly fall apart. So, at 1 in the morning, when the walls of the John family residence began pressing in from all sides, he took the car out. No driver. No destination. Just the dark and the city moving past him in blurs of light, and the quiet that he had been chasing for 4 days straight. He wasn't thinking about the road. He was thinking about his father's hands. About a conversation they were supposed to have next month that would now never happen. About how the empire his family had built across 3 generations suddenly felt less like a legacy and more like a sentence. He He was thinking about all of this when Pearl stepped off the curb. The impact was not loud. That was the thing that would stay with him. It wasn't loud at all. It was just sudden, and then there was silence, and then there was a woman on the ground, and pages everywhere, and Hyunwoo's hands shaking on the steering wheel as he stepped out into the cold. He knelt beside her before he even made a conscious decision to move. Pearl was conscious, but barely. Her breathing was shallow, sharp, the kind of breathing that tells you something inside is broken. Her sketchbook had landed face open in a puddle, ink dissolving slowly into the rainwater, and for reasons Hyunwoo could not explain, that detail gutted him more than anything else. All those pages. All that work. Dissolving. "Don't move," he said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "I'm calling an ambulance." Pearl turned her head toward him slowly. Even in pain, even with her cheek pressed against wet asphalt, there was something in her eyes that refused to be reduced. She looked at him the way people look at someone they're already deciding not to trust. "You weren't watching the road," she said. Quiet. Certain. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. The ambulance took 11 minutes. Hyunwoo knelt beside her the entire time, jacket off his shoulders and draped over her, one hand hovering uselessly close to hers because he didn't know what else to do with it. He kept talking low, steady, nothing important because silence felt like abandonment, and he had already done enough damage tonight. Pearl didn't respond much, but she didn't close her eyes either. She kept them fixed on the sky above Seoul, jaw tight against the pain, and Hyunwoo found himself studying the lines of her face with a focus that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with the quiet devastation of recognizing someone extraordinary in the worst possible circumstances. The hospital confirmed what the impact had already announced. 2 fractured ribs, a broken collarbone, soft tissue damage along her left shoulder that would make lifting her arm, let alone sketching, impossible for at least 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Pearl heard the doctor and said nothing. She stared at the ceiling of the private room and did the math so fast it must have hurt worse than the injury itself. 3 weeks meant her showcase. 3 weeks meant the collection she hadn't finished. 3 weeks meant every conversation she'd had with investors, with the venue coordinator, with the 2 Lagos journalists who had booked flights specifically to cover her debut. 3 weeks meant everything she had built was suddenly balancing on a very thin edge. Hyunwoo stood in the corridor outside her room for a long time after the doctor briefed him. He had given his name at reception without thinking and watched the nurse's expression shift in that specific way that told him the John name had registered. It always registered. He made 3 calls. His lawyer, his assistant, the head of his family's private medical facility on the east side of the city. Then he walked back into Pearl's room and stood at the foot of her bed and waited for her to look at him. She did. Eventually. "I want to cover everything," he said. "Medical costs, recovery care, whatever your showcase needs, staffing, production, whatever can be managed without you being physically present. I'll make sure it doesn't fall apart." Pearl looked at him for a long moment. "You think money fixes this?" "No," he said. And he meant it. "But it's what I have right now." Something shifted in her expression. Not softness, not yet, but the faintest crack in the wall. She was in pain and exhausted, and her entire dream was 3 weeks from either surviving or collapsing, and the man responsible was standing at the foot of her bed, offering her the only thing he knew how to give. She didn't say yes that night, but she didn't say no either. He moved her to the John private residence 2 days later, against the quiet protest of his mother and the loud protest of his head of security, who reminded him, not for the first time, that Hyunwoo had more important things to concern himself with than a woman he didn't know. Hyunwoo didn't argue. He rarely argued. He just did the thing anyway. The recovery suite was on the 2nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows facing a garden that was just beginning to ease into spring. Pearl arrived in a wheelchair she hated, wearing an expression that made it clear she had not fully accepted the situation and was simply too injured to fight it effectively yet. She took one long look around the room. The clean lines, the impossible quiet, the vase of white peonies someone had placed on the windowsill, and then she looked at Hyunwoo standing in the doorway and said, "I want my sketchbook replaced. Every page. Same paperweight." He almost smiled. "I'll have it by morning. And I want my design assistant to have full access to this address. Whatever hours she needs."
Done.
Pearl nodded slowly, like she was filing terms in a contract. Then she turned back to the window. Then we understand each other.
They didn't yet.
Not even close. But something had been established in that exchange, a language between two people who both understood what it meant to lead, to demand, to refuse to collapse under pressure. And Hyunwoo, walking back down the corridor toward a life he hadn't asked for, felt something loosen slightly in his chest. It was the first time in 5 days that his grief had moved over, even just an inch, to make room for something else. He didn't know what to call it yet. He would, soon enough. The first 3 days were strictly transactional. Pearl's design assistant Jian came every morning at 9, laptop and fabric swatches in tow, and the two of them would work through whatever Pearl could manage from the bed, directing, deciding, adjusting, her voice doing the work her hands couldn't yet. Hyunwoo made sure the household staff left them undisturbed. He made sure the sketchbook arrived as promised, every page the correct weight. He made sure her meals came on time and that the room stayed warm because Jian had mentioned offhandedly that Pearl always complained about the cold. He told himself he was simply managing a responsibility, clearing a debt, being thorough the way he was thorough about everything. He was lying to himself, but he wasn't ready to know that yet. Pearl, for her part, kept her walls exactly where she had built them. She was polite in the careful way that people are polite when they don't fully trust their surroundings. She said thank you when it was necessary. She made no requests that weren't practical. She gave Hyunwoo no more of herself than the situation demanded. But on the 4th night, something shifted. She couldn't sleep. The ribs made every position uncomfortable, and her mind, that relentless, beautiful, exhausting mind, kept running through the collection's unfinished centerpiece gown like a finger tracing a knot it couldn't undo. She had been lying in the dark for 2 hours when she heard it. Piano. Soft, unhurried, drifting up from somewhere below. Not a recording. The imperfections were too human, the pauses too deliberate. Someone was playing at 2 in the morning with the kind of quiet focus that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with survival. Pearl sat up slowly, jaw tight against the ache in her ribs, and listened. She didn't know why it moved her. She wasn't even sure it did, exactly, not in any way she was prepared to name. But something about the sound of a man playing piano alone in the dark, in a house full of people and completely unreachable by all of them, made her chest do something she hadn't given it permission to do. She didn't go downstairs. But she listened until he stopped. She asked Ji-yeon about it the next morning, casually, the way you ask about something you've already decided doesn't matter. Ji-yeon told her that Hyunwoo's father had taught him to play, that he hadn't touched the piano in years, as far as anyone knew, that his father had died less than 2 weeks ago. Pearl said nothing. She picked up her pencil with her good hand and went back to sketching. But that evening, when Hyunwoo came to check on her, he did this once a day, brief and businesslike, standing just inside the doorway like a man who had not given himself permission to fully enter. Pearl looked up from her sketchbook and said, "You play well."
He went very still. "The piano," she said.
Last night, something moved across his face. Not embarrassment exactly. Something more unguarded than that. Like she had seen a room he hadn't meant to leave open. "I didn't think anyone could hear," he said. "I couldn't sleep." She held his gaze. It helped, actually. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of two people recalibrating, quietly, carefully, the distance they had agreed to keep between them. Hyunwoo looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded once, said goodnight, and left. But the next morning he sent breakfast up with a small card that said nothing except, "The garden is warm today if you want air." No signature. He didn't need one. Pearl went to the garden. A staff member helped her downstairs, and she settled into the chair that had been positioned, she noticed, at exactly the right angle to catch the morning light without the wind.
Someone had thought about that.
Someone had paid attention. She was sitting there, sketchbook open, pencil moving slowly across the page, when Hyunwoo appeared. He wasn't dressed for work yet. Dark trousers, simple shirt, hair slightly undone, and Pearl registered, in the most inconvenient way possible, that he was extraordinarily handsome in the way that quiet men sometimes are. Not loud about it, just constructed beautifully, like something that had been made with patience. He sat down across from her without asking. She didn't tell him to leave. They didn't talk immediately. The garden did most of the work. Birds, wind, the soft sound of a city existing beyond the walls. And then Pearl tilted her sketchbook toward him, showing him the rough outline of the centerpiece gown she had been wrestling with for weeks. "Tell me what you see," she said. He looked at it for a long time. Really looked, not the polite glance of someone humoring her, but the focused attention of someone actually trying to understand. "It looks like something that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to be seen," he said. Pearl stared at him. Then she looked back at the sketch. And quietly, without a word, she picked up her pencil and began to draw. He had just described exactly what was missing. Neither of them acknowledged what had just happened between them. But something had, and they both knew it, and the garden held it gently between them like a secret neither was ready to speak aloud. The days that followed had a rhythm neither of them had planned for. Mornings in the garden became their unspoken arrangement. Hyunwoo would appear, never too early, never announced, and Pearl would already be there, sketchbook open, pencil moving.
Sometimes they talked.
Sometimes they didn't. But the silence between them had changed character entirely. It was no longer the silence of two strangers managing an awkward obligation. It had become the kind of silence that only grows between people who have started to feel safe with each other, unhurried, warm, carrying more meaning than most conversations. Pearl found herself listening for his footsteps on the garden path before she could admit she was doing it. Hyunwoo found himself finishing his early calls faster than necessary, for reasons he was only beginning to be honest about. Jiyeon noticed. She said nothing, but Pearl caught the look, that particular expression of a woman filing information away with great personal satisfaction, and chose to ignore it entirely. The collection was coming back to life. With Pearl directing and Jiyeon executing, the showcase was no longer in danger of collapsing. The centerpiece gown had found its shape almost immediately after that morning in the garden, as though Hyunwoo's words had unlocked something Pearl's own mind had been circling without landing on. The fabric was a deep midnight silk, structured at the shoulders and dissolving into softness at the hem, a gown that knew exactly what it was and refused to apologize for any of it. Pearl had designed it thinking about herself. She realized, quietly, that she had also been thinking about him. It was on the 9th day that the first crack appeared in the careful world they had built inside those walls. Hyunwoo came to the garden later than usual, and something was different about him the moment Pearl saw his face. The composure was intact, it was always intact, she was learning that about him, but underneath it something was pulled tight in a way that hadn't been there before. She didn't ask immediately. She had learned that Hyunwoo was a man who needed a moment to arrive at things, and that patience was the only language that reached him quickly. Eventually, he said, "There's a faction within the board. Men who served under my father for years. They've decided that the transition of leadership should not be straightforward." Pearl set her pencil down. Meaning? Meaning they believe the empire should be restructured under a committee rather than passed to me directly. He said it with perfect calm, which somehow made it sound more dangerous. They've been building this position quietly for months. They waited until my father was barely cold. The weight of that settled between them. "What are you going to do?"
Pearl asked.
He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived in his home, Pearl saw it fully. Not just grief, not just pressure. The specific exhaustion of a man who had been handed a war he didn't start and was expected to win it before he had finished mourning. "What I have to," he said. Pearl held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached across the small table between them and placed her hand over his. Not romantic, or not only romantic. It was the gesture of one person who knows what it is to carry something enormous telling another person, "I see it. I see you." Hyunwoo looked down at her hand. Something in his jaw released. He turned his hand over beneath hers, slowly, and held it. They stayed like that for a long time, the garden quiet around them, the city existing at a respectful distance, and something irrevocable passing between them without either of them needing to name it yet. That evening Pearl got the call that rewrote everything. It was her showcase coordinator. The venue, the one Pearl had spent 4 months securing, the one that seated 300 and had the lighting infrastructure her collection demanded, had canceled. 48 hours notice. No explanation beyond a vague reference to a scheduling conflict that Pearl knew, in the specific way that women who have been underestimated their whole lives know things, was not a scheduling conflict at all. She sat on the edge of her bed after the call and did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But her hand gripped the phone with a force that said everything her face refused to show. Ji-yeon was ready to call every alternative venue in Seoul. Pearl told her to wait. She sat in the quiet of that beautiful room, the one that wasn't hers, in the house that wasn't hers, in a life that had been violently rearranged 3 weeks ago by a man currently downstairs carrying his own impossible weight, and she thought. And then, before she had fully decided whether it was wise, she got up and went downstairs. Hyunwoo was in his study, documents spread across the desk, reading with the focused stillness of someone used to making large decisions alone. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. Pearl met his eyes. "I need a favor." He closed the document in front of him without hesitation. "Tell me." And here was the thing about John Hyunwoo that Pearl had not anticipated, had not budgeted for, had not built a wall against. He listened like her words were the only thing in the room. That was the moment she felt herself begin to fall. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just the slow, certain tilt of a heart that has decided, against all reasonable advice, to trust someone completely. She told him about the venue. He heard every word. Then he said, "The John Grand Hall has been dark since my father's funeral. It seats 400. It's yours if you want it." Pearl stared at him. "The lighting system was upgraded last year," he added quietly. "I think it will do what you need." The night of the showcase arrived the way important nights always do, faster than expected and heavier than imagined. Pearl stood backstage in the John Grand Hall, one arm still moving carefully, her collarbone 3 weeks healed but still quietly reminding her of everything it had cost to get here. The hall was full. 380 seats, every one of them taken. The Lagos journalists were in the third row. Investors she had been chasing for 2 years were seated beside Seoul's most influential fashion editors. Ji-yeon was running the floor with the focused energy of a woman who had survived the last 3 weeks and emerged with something to prove on Pearl's behalf. Pearl had designed every piece in this collection, from a bed, from a garden chair, from the quiet architecture of a recovery that had turned into something she still didn't have clean language for. The centerpiece gown, midnight silk, structured shoulders, softness at the hem, was on the final model, waiting in the wings. She looked out through the curtain gap at the audience and found him immediately. Hyunwoo was seated at the far end of the front row, slightly apart from everyone else the way powerful men tend to be even in rooms full of people. Dark suit, composed face. But when the lights shifted and the first model stepped out and the audience drew a collective breath at what Pearl had made, Pearl watched something happen to his expression that he clearly had no intention of letting anyone see.
Pride.
Quiet, certain, unperformed pride. Like a man watching someone he believes in prove that he was right to. Pearl turned away from the curtain before he could feel her looking. The collection stopped the room. Not politely. Not in the careful, appreciative way of audiences managing their enthusiasm. It stopped the room the way truth sometimes does, suddenly and completely, leaving people momentarily unsure what to do with what they've just witnessed. When the centerpiece gown came out last, the midnight silk moving under the lights exactly the way Pearl had seen it move in her mind 6 months ago, the applause began before the model reached the end of the runway. Pearl heard it from backstage and stood very still, hand pressed flat against the wall, letting it move through her. 6 years. 3 rejections. 1 accident. 3 weeks in a stranger's house that had somehow become the most clarifying period of her entire life. She walked out when Ji-yeon pushed her gently forward, and the room rose. Pearl stood at the end of the runway and looked out at 380 people on their feet and felt something so large and so long-awaited move through her chest that for a moment she couldn't locate the expression for it. She found Hyunwoo's eyes across the room. He wasn't clapping. He was just watching her, still and steady in the way he always was, with an expression that said everything the applause around him was too loud to carry. Pearl held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked back at the room and smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing anyone in that hall had ever seen. Afterward, when the guests had thinned and the hall was settling into its quiet, Pearl found him standing by the tall windows at the far end of the room, looking out at the Seoul skyline. She crossed to him without rehearsing what she would say because she had learned that the best things she had ever said to him arrived unrehearsed. She stood beside him at the window, close enough that their arms almost touched. "You gave me this hall," she said. "You filled it," he answered. The city glittered below them, indifferent and magnificent. Pearl looked at his reflection in the glass, the sharp lines of his face, the weight he carried even now, even here, even in a moment that had nothing to do with empires or boardrooms or inheritance. "When I go back to my studio," she said slowly, "I don't want to pretend this was just a recovery arrangement." Hyunwoo was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't absence but accumulation. "Neither do I," he said. He turned to look at her then, and Pearl turned to look at him, and they were close, close enough that the rest of the room fell entirely away, and something was about to happen that had been building since a rainy Seoul street and scattered sketchbook pages and a man who knelt in the cold because he couldn't bring himself to leave. "Pearl." Ji-yeon's voice cut through the moment like a needle through silk. "The photographer from Vogue Korea needs you for the closing shot. He's leaving in 5 minutes. Pearl closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. When she opened them, Hyunwoo was looking at her with an expression caught perfectly between amusement and quiet suffering. She exhaled a short breath that was almost a laugh, pressed her lips together, and went. But she looked back once, and he was still watching. 3 days later, Pearl came to collect the last of her things. She had packed everything into 2 neat bags, her sketchbooks, her fabrics, the small things that had migrated slowly from her studio into the warmth of that recovery room over 3 weeks. She was healed enough. She had her showcase behind her. She had absolutely no reasonable excuse left to stay, and she had told herself firmly that morning, while getting dressed, that she was a woman who did not linger in places she had no business lingering. Hyunwoo standing in the doorway. Not dramatically. Not blocking her like a man making a scene. Just standing there, one hand resting against the doorframe, looking at her with that particular expression she had catalogued without meaning to, the one that was completely composed on the surface and entirely unconvinced underneath. "You're not completely well yet," he said. Pearl gave him a look. "My doctor cleared me yesterday." "Your doctor cleared you from the medical requirements. That is different from being completely well." "Hyunwoo, your left shoulder still gives you trouble when it rains." "It rained this morning." Pearl stared at him. "That is the most elaborate excuse I have ever heard." "It's not an excuse. It's an observation." She shifted her bag higher on her shoulder, went slightly, which she would never admit was because of the rain, and met his eyes directly. "This can't work," she said. "You know that. Your world and mine, the board, the empire, my career, the way people will talk, the way your mother already looks at me like I'm a problem she's calculating how to solve. It's too complicated. It makes no sense." Hyunwoo looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out, took the bag from her shoulder with the quiet certainty of a man who had already made a decision, set it down on the floor beside him, and pulled her in. The kiss was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was the kiss of a man who had been waiting long enough and had decided, calmly, completely, that he was done waiting. Deep and certain and so unhurried that Pearl forgot, somewhere in the middle of it, every reasonable argument she had just made. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing differently than before. "None of that changes how I feel," he said quietly. Pearl looked up at him. The bag was still on the floor. The door was still open behind her. He reached past her and locked it. She didn't stop him. They spent the rest of that day exactly as they should have spent it weeks ago, tangled in the quiet of that house, learning each other without urgency, without the weight of recovery or grief or empire pressing in from the edges. Just 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely, painful, inconvenient way possible, and had decided that the finding was worth everything it had cost. Pearl sketched at the garden table while Hyunwoo took his calls beside her, his free hand resting close to hers between sentences. They ate dinner late, unhurried, talking about everything and nothing the way people do when they have silently agreed that time no longer needs to be managed so carefully. He played piano after midnight, and this time she came downstairs and sat in the chair by the window and listened with her eyes closed, and he played differently knowing she was there. Softer, more honest, the music doing what words between them had always struggled to do cleanly. It was, Pearl thought, the most ordinary, extraordinary day of her life. But ordinary was never going to be the whole story. Because outside those walls the board was moving. The Empire was restless. And John Hyunwoo, who had spent 3 weeks discovering what it felt like to want something purely for himself, was about to find out exactly what the world he had inherited was willing to do to take it from him. And Pearl Okoye, who had come to Seoul to be seen, who had survived an accident that should have broken her, who had built a dream from fabric and stubbornness and late nights and refused to let anyone dim it, was about to discover that loving a man like Hyunwoo was not a quiet thing. It would ask everything of her. The question was whether everything was enough. If this story found something in you today, you already know what to do. Hit that like button, share this with someone who deserves a love story, and subscribe because Pearl and Hyunwoo are just getting started. Drop your city in the comments. I read every single one. And ask yourself this. When a love this complicated, this powerful, this beautifully accidental finds you, do you stay or do you protect yourself? Come back for the next episode, because that answer is about to get very interesting.